Hey everyone, Miss G here to talk to you today about writing decimals into their fraction form. So last week we talked about how fractions can be turned into mixed numbers and mixed numbers could be put into their fraction form. And then we talked about how both fractions and mixed numbers can be translated into equivalent decimals. So, for example, if I had the number in fraction form 13/10, I know that that is a fraction and it's greater than 1, and I could translate it into its mixed number form, and that would be 1 3/10. And then we talked about how mixed numbers and also fractions can be put into their decimal form using division. So I know that this would be the decimal 1, and then I would do out 3 divided by 10 on my paper, and that would be worth 1 3/10. 1.3 is what I would get out. We saw that fractions or mixed numbers, when turned into decimal forms, there are two options. So there are terminating decimals like this one, but sometimes you also got repeating decimals, and those came from different fractions, but you ended up with a decimal that repeated the same thing forever and ever. Well, today's lesson is about how, if you're given a decimal, do you either write that number in mixed number form or fraction form? So how do you take a decimal and get something that has fractions in it? What we're going to be looking at, so let's look at 1 3/10 first, just to get an idea. Well, 1.3 we know is equivalent to 1 3/10 written like this. Let's see what they have in common. They have that same whole number, 1, in both forms. And then we have 3/10 and 0.3. Well, if I read this decimal 0.3, I read it the fancy or correct way, it's read as 3/10, because we're in the 10ths place. 3/10, 3/10. I hope you're seeing that these two things are related. So the place value of a decimal is going to equate to what it looks like in its mixed number form or its fraction form. So let's look at some examples. So on your paper at the top here, you have terminating decimals, and we're going to put them into their fraction form or their mixed number form. So for our first one, we have 0.625. The first thing I need to do is figure out what place value am I in. So this decimal goes all the way 10ths, hundredths, thousandths place. So that's going to tell us the denominator of the fraction. So this is in, I have 625 thousandths. The top of my fraction comes from what is written here after the decimal, and the bottom comes from that place value I was in. So to turn a decimal into its fraction, I need to know the place value of the decimal. And then that place value becomes the denominator. So 0.625 is equivalent to 625 thousandths. But when I look at this fraction, I think, okay, that's a fine fraction, except it's not in lowest terms. It is not a simplified fraction. There's probably a much smaller fraction or a much nicer looking version of this fraction. And so I'm going to simplify to find it. So I will think, okay, is there a number that goes in the top and the bottom of this fraction? And my first guess is 5. because they both end in 5 or 0. But I actually know that 25 goes into both of these numbers, so I'm gonna guess 25. I'm gonna divide top and bottom by 25 to simplify this fraction down. 625, when I divide it by 5, I get 16. I'm sorry, I get 25. I'm thinking ahead. So that becomes 25 on the top. And then when I divide 1,000 by 25, there are 40 25s inside of 1,000. So I've simplified a little bit. I look at this fraction and I'm like, okay, that's still not fully simplified. So they both still end in a 5 and 0, so there must both be divisible by 5, top and bottom. So I'll divide the top by 5, 25 by 5 is 5, and 40 by 5 is 8. And so after I've simplified, I do come down to a fraction in its lowest terms. There's nothing in common between the top and the bottom, so I know I'm done. And this is the fraction form that I'm gonna say is equivalent to 0.625. We always wanna have the most simplified fraction we can. So I'm gonna add that into my steps. Simplify as much as possible. All right, so we just took our first fraction, our first decimal, and figured out what its simplest lowest terms fraction is. 5/8 and 0.625 have the exact same value. They are just written in those two different forms. Let's look at a few more. So negative 0.48. So my first job is to think, okay, what is the place value of this decimal? We go up to the tenths, hundredths place. So that means when I go to write this as a fraction, I'm going to have so many hundredths, because I was in the hundredths place, and I have 48 hundredths. One thing I noticed is I started with negative 0.48, so negative 48 hundredths. So when it's turned into its fraction form, it still has to be equivalent, so we need to make sure we write our negative. Looks good, 48 out of 100, negative 48 out of 100. I've taken care of all of that, but I know that this is not in its simplest form. Because 48 and 100, well, I'm noticing that they both share 2. I can divide top and bottom by 2. So to simplify this fraction down, I need to do that. So I'm gonna hold on to that negative sign, and then 48 divided by 2 is 24, and 100 divided by 2 is 50. And I'm gonna pause and I'm gonna think, do they have anything in common still? And I'm like, oh, shucks, they do have something in common. They both have in common 2. Again, they're both even, so I gotta keep going to simplify. So I have negative, and then 24 divided by 2 is 12, and 50 divided by 2 is 25. So at this point, I think of what I know about 12 and 25, and I know that they cannot be simplified anymore. So that means that the fraction form of negative 0.48 is negative 12/25. One more example with these nice terminating or stopping decimals. 3 and 7/10. So for 3 and 7/10, or 3.7, I do only go to the tenths place, so I'll keep that in mind. But I do have 3 wholes here. So this is going to be easiest to turn into its mixed number form first. So I'll keep that same number of wholes, 3. And then I'll write this part as the fraction part of my mixed number. So 7/10. And I'll check that fraction and ask myself, do 7 and 10 have anything in common I can simplify? The answer is no. So 3.7 is equal to 3 7/10. So that was our first type of decimal, our terminating decimals. But we can also take repeating decimals and turn them into their fraction or mixed number forms. And it's going to be fairly similar. We are first going to need to know the place value of the decimal. But our process will change just slightly after that. So our first repeating decimal is 0.16 repeating. So I know that that is the decimal 0.16161616 forever. And I can't actually, I don't know where this decimal stops, so I can't say, oh, we get to the thousandths place or the millionths place, because this decimal does this forever. So we have to use something slightly different when I translate it to its fraction form. So instead of, the part that repeats looks like it goes to the hundredths place because it's 2 decimals. But instead of using 100 on the bottom, I'm going to use one less than 100. I'm going to use 99. So I'm saying that 0.16 repeating is the same as 16/99, one less than that place value. And you might be a little wary of that. So I'm going to show you that 16/99, if I went the other way, I'd get a repeating decimal. So if I divided 16 by 99, went from the fraction to the decimal, look what I get, 0.16, 0.16, 0.16, 0.16. And then there's this 2 here at the end. That's because our calculator rounded. But really, this repeating decimal would go on forever. So that's the trick. Instead of dividing by that place value, we're going to divide by one less than the place value. So 1 less than the place value becomes the denominator. And by doing that, we get these repeating decimals. So if I have something that looks like it's in the hundredths when it's repeating, we're going to divide by 99. If I have something that looks like it's in the thousandths, we're going to divide by 999. If we have something that looks like it's in the tenths, we'll divide by just 9, one less than that value. And our final step will be always simplify. Always, always, always simplify if you need to. So let's check this fraction. Do 16 and 99 have anything in common? And the answer is no, so we're done. Let's do 2 more examples of these repeating decimals. So negative 0.6 repeating would be the decimal negative 0.666666666 forever. So I know that I can't figure out where that decimal is going to stop to use its place value. So I'll use this little trick. I know it's going to say negative when it's a fraction because we're equivalent. And I'll say, okay, this is 6 in the tenths place. But since it's a repeating one, we're going to put a 9 down here, 1 less than 10. And so I get the fraction negative 6/9. Now hopefully your little simplifying brain is talking to you because both 6 and 9 share the factor of 3. So we need to simplify that factor out. So I'll divide top and bottom of my fraction by 3 and I'll keep that negative sign with me. So 6 divided by 3, 2, 9 divided by 3, 3. So my decimal negative 0.6 repeating is equivalent to negative 2/3. Final one, 4.2 repeating. So this is very similar to the last time we had a whole. in front of the decimal point is that we knew that we were going to go to a mixed number so that we could just keep that whole. So this is going to be 4 and something, something. Well, I see that I have 2 in the 10th place, but it's repeating. So I'm going to have 2, not tenths, but ninths. And I'll check, can this fraction part be simplified? No, it cannot. 4 and 2 ninths will be my repeating decimal. So your job is going to be to answer the questions on page 2. You're going to try that out. There are 7 questions, repeating and terminating decimals, that you need to turn into their fraction or mixed number form. When you're finished, I'm going to have you go back and check in with Ms. McClelland and make sure you got those answers right and ask any questions that you have. I'm excited to work with you when I see you next. Have a great day.